Imagine, just for a second, that you are the richest man in the world.
Right, a nice thought.
Yeah. I mean, you spent years building this massive globe-spanning empire of steamships. You've secured exclusive government contracts, and you've created what is, at the time, the most valuable high-traffic shipping lane on Earth. It is literally the undisputed artery of global wealth.
The absolute center of it all.
Exactly. And then, seemingly overnight, a mercenary like a failed doctor and journalist who commands this tiny private army literally steals that entire transit route right out from under you. He just takes it.
It's almost unthinkable.
Right. So what do? You don't just sue him. You don't wait for international courts to weigh in. You use your unfathomable private fortune to buy a war. You leverage every ounce of your capital to systematically strangle his regime from across the ocean.
Which is exactly what happens.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today we are opening up a stack of fascinating but deeply sobering historical sources. We're looking at William Walker's own, frankly chilling 1860 memoir, The War in Nicaragua, the modern scholarship of historians like Michel Gobat, corporate ledgers of the Accessory Transit Company, and the founding national proclamations of Costa Rica. Our mission here is to unravel a forgotten but profoundly pivotal chapter of 19th century history.
And we really need to maintain a measured documentary approach to this material today because we are looking at a moment where the destiny of multiple nations hung by a thread. The events we are unpacking represent some of the absolute darkest hours of interventionist history.
Yeah, it's definitely a heavy topic.
It is. We are essentially navigating two braided stories. First, you have the terrifying trajectory of William Walker, an American who basically talked his way into ruling Nicaragua and attempted to build a literal pro-slavery empire from scratch. And second, the story of the Central American people themselves. The nations that united to defeat him and, in the crucible of that existential fight, actually forged their own modern national identities.
So throughout this deep dive, there is this central historical tension that we constantly have to weigh for you, the listener. It's the puzzle at the heart of our sources today. Was William Walker's rise and his absolute collapse driven by his terrifying pro-slavery ideology? Or was his entire fate dictated by the cold, hard logistics of Cornelius Vanderbilt's money, his corporate shipping empire, and Nicaragua's own internal civil war?
Was it the power of a racist idea or the power of private capital? That's the core question.
Right. And to answer that, we have to start with the physical landscape, don't we?
We do. To understand how an American mercenary could ever become a Central American president, we really have to look at the bloody geography of the 1850s. The Civil War in Nicaragua essentially left the front door wide open for foreign intervention. Because geography is destiny, and in the mid-1850s, Nicaragua was arguably the most strategic real estate on the planet.
Which, feels really counterintuitive to how we map global power today. But you have to put yourself in the mindset of the era. The California gold rush is in full swing. Hundreds of thousands of people on the east coast of the United States and from Europe are trying to get to San Francisco as fast as humanly possible to strike it rich.
And the logistical nightmare of the 1850s was that there was no transcontinental railroad yet. Traveling overland across the North American continent took months. I mean, it meant braving the elements, disease, incredibly harsh terrain.
It was deadly.
Exactly. Alternatively, sailing all the way down around the southern tip of South America, navigating the really treacherous waters of Cape Horn, was equally perilous and agonizingly slow. It could take half a year. So the fastest, most logical route was to cut right through the middle of the Americas.
Right. You sail down to Central America, cross the narrow landmass, and catch another ship sailing up the Pacific coast. It's like Nicaragua was acting as a 19th century Panama Canal decades before anyone actually dug the Panama Canal. It was the ultimate strategic choke point.
It was. Nicaragua offered a uniquely advantageous geographic shortcut compared to the rest of the isthmus. If you look at the map of the route, a traveler could sail down from New York or New Orleans to the port of San Juan del Norte, right on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua.
Right.
And from that port, they would board smaller, shallow draft steamboats and travel up the San Juan River. That river empties directly into Lake Nicaragua, which is this massive, sprawling inland sea.
So you aren't even traveling over land yet. You're just sailing deeper into the interior of the country on fresh water.
Precisely. You sail all the way across that massive lake, and when you reach the western shore, you are left with this tiny strip of land, it's roughly 12 miles wide, separating the lake from the Pacific Ocean. Passengers would just disembark, take a quick stagecoach ride across a macadamized road over those 12 miles, and arrive at the Pacific port of San Juan del Sur,
where massive ocean-going steamships are just waiting to take them straight to San Francisco. It is basically a natural canal, just missing that final 12-mile trench. Whoever controls that specific multi-stage transit route, the river, the lake, the road, they essentially control the flow of global wealth. They control the gold coming east, the passengers going west, the mail, the commerce. I mean, it is the primary artery of the mid-19th century global economy.
And the entity that controlled that artery was Cornelius Vanderbilt. He saw the geographic potential early on, and he secured the exclusive rights from the Nicaraguan government to operate this route. He established a massive corporate apparatus called the Accessory Transit Company.
So he owned everything.
Everything. Vanderbilt owned the ocean steamers on the Atlantic, he owned the shallow riverboats on the San Juan, he owned the lake steamers, and he owned the carriages crossing that 12-mile strip. It was a totally vertically integrated monopoly of movement.
So Vanderbilt turns a relatively quiet Central American republic into a massive geopolitical flashpoint simply by running his boats through it. The transit concession becomes the absolute economic engine of the region. But while Vanderbilt is moving, millions of dollars of gold and thousands of passengers across the country itself, Nicaragua, is actively falling apart.
Yes. In 1854 and 1855, Nicaragua was tearing itself apart in a brutal oligarchic civil war. Following their independence from the Spanish Empire and the subsequent collapse of a unified Central American Federation, Nicaragua, like a lot of newly independent states, really struggled to establish a stable central authority.
There was a massive power vacuum.
Right, and it was filled by intense, bitter regionalism. The country was deeply divided between two main factions, centered in two rival colonial cities.
You have the Democratic Party, which we can think of as the liberals, operating out of the city of Leon. And opposing them, you have the Legitimist Party, the conservatives, based in the city of Granada. And these two factions are just bleeding each other dry, destroying their own infrastructure, trying to secure absolute control over the nation.
And this is where the scholarship of Michel Gobat is really essential for understanding the mechanics of what happens next, because the traditional, simplified historical narrative often paints William Walker as a rogue pirate who just showed up on a boat one day and invaded a peaceful nation out of nowhere.
Like a cartoon villain.
Exactly. But the reality, documented in the primary sources, is much more complex and tragic. Walker did not initially invade Nicaragua. He was invited.
The losing side of the Civil War hired him. The Leon liberals were getting crushed by the Granada conservatives. They were desperate, facing total political annihilation. So they reached out to this American mercenary who had a reputation for organizing private military expeditions, and they contracted him to bring a company of men to turn the tide.
They wanted a vanguard of modern American military tactics. But organizing a private army to fight in a foreign war openly violates United States neutrality laws. You couldn't just, actively recruit mercenaries in San Francisco and sail them to a nation the U.S. was at peace with. The federal authorities would seize your ships.
So Walker and the Leon faction used a legal loophole. They deliberately cloaked the entire military contract under the guise of colonization. The paperwork stated they were simply sending peaceful agricultural colonists who just happened to be incredibly well armed and bringing crates of military supplies for self-defense.
It was a very thin veneer, but it was enough to slip past the port authorities in California. On May 3rd, 1855, Walker sails from San Francisco. He does arrive with a massive armada. He lands in Nicaragua with roughly 60 men. They styled themselves the American Phalanx.
I have to pause on the sheer hubris of the Leon faction here. I mean, by inviting a man like Walker, an ambitious ideological mercenary, to act as their modernizing liberal ally, did the Leon leadership completely fatally misunderstand the difference between a hired gun and a conqueror? They thought they were bringing in a tool to break the power of the Granada elites. They viewed him as a subordinate instrument of local Nicaraguan politics.
It is the classic tragedy of the hired mercenary. The historical consensus shows that many Nicaraguans, particularly within the liberal faction, initially welcomed Walker. They really believed they could control him and use his American firepower to stabilize the country on their terms. But Walker had absolutely no intention of taking orders.
Right, he wasn't there to take a paycheck and go home.
No, his own ambitions were vastly larger than the scope of their local civil war, and they quickly outgrew the employers who had signed his initial contract.
Walker was brought in to win a local war, but almost immediately the power dynamic flips. We need to look at how an American with 60 guys transforms from a hired colonel into the puppet master of a sovereign nation.
The military ascension happened with shocking speed. While his numbers were small, even as local Nicaraguan recruits and subsequent boatloads of American adventurers swelled his ranks to around 170 men in those early months, Walker brought something the local militias lacked, which was disciplined, concentrated firepower.
He had modern repeating rifles, right?
Yes, his men were well equipped, and Walker possessed a ruthless willingness to just discard established rules of engagement.
He wasn't interested in the traditional, slow-moving siege warfare the local factions were using. He was audacious, and the pivotal turning point is the Battle of La Virgen on September 3, 1855.
Walker's relatively small phalanx finds itself facing a much larger legitimist army, the conservative forces of Granada, and Walker breaks them completely. He routs the enemy army in the field. Now, standard 19th century military doctrine would dictate that after such a victory, Walker should slowly press his advantage, consolidate the territory for his employers in Leon, and fight a methodical war of attrition.
But Walker bypasses the traditional playbook entirely. He looks at the disorganized state of the retreating enemy and decides to make a lightning strike directly at the enemy's heart. He ignores the remaining armies in the field, marches his men, and captures the city of Granada itself on October 13, 1855.
It shocked everyone. In the span of a few months, a hired foreign colonel goes from leading a tiny band of disguised colonists to physically occupying the political, cultural, and economic capital of the conservative faction. The psychological blow to the Nicaraguan political system was absolute.
Just put yourself in the shoes of a citizen of Granada waking up on the morning of October 14th. Your city is a stronghold of conservative power. You go to sleep, and you wake up to find the streets occupied by a Tennessee journalist and a couple hundred heavily armed Americans who do not speak your language, do not practice your customs, and hold the keys to the armory. I mean, it is the definition of an overnight coup.
It was profoundly disorienting for the local populace. But Walker was cunning enough to know the limits of his immediate power. He understood he could not simply declare himself king the morning after taking the city.
Because they just revolt.
Exactly. The local population would have rebelled instantly, and the neighboring Central American nations would have crushed his tiny force. So he constructed this elaborate illusion of local control.
He decides to rule from the shadows. Instead of putting himself in the presidential chair, Walker installs a man named Patricio Rivas as a provisional puppet president. And the brilliant, albeit cynical part of this move is that Patricio Rivas wasn't a member of the liberal Leon faction that hired Walker. Rivas was a prominent legitimist. He was a conservative from Granada.
By elevating a respected conservative figurehead, Walker gave his newly forged regime a native bipartisan face. To the exhausted Nicaraguan people, and more importantly to foreign diplomats observing the situation, it looked as though the bitter civil war had simply ended in a conventional negotiated compromise. A coalition government had been formed.
It provides total plausible deniability. Rivas is signing the papers, Rivas is sitting in the office, but Walker retains the title of Commander of the Army. And as the mechanics of power dictate, whoever controls the men with the rifles controls the state. The Rivas government was a pure client regime, acting as a mask for Walker's true intentions.
But masks require immense effort to maintain, and Walker's ideological ambitions were far too vast to remain hidden behind a local figurehead. By 1856, he begins to drop the act. He increasingly marginalizes Rivas, overruling his decisions and making it totally clear who is actually in charge. Rivas eventually realizes the grave danger he is in, recognizes he is merely a pawn in a foreign takeover, and he physically flees the capital to join the growing opposition against Walker.
And with the puppet gone, Walker stops pretending. He holds a highly fraudulent, heavily coerced election. And on July 12, 1856, William Walker drops all pretense and formally inaugurates himself as the president of Nicaragua.
This is the moment the narrative shifts from a bizarre regional oddity into a massive, unprecedented international incident. Because less than 2 months prior to this fraudulent inauguration, on May 20, 1856, the President of the United States, Franklin Pierce, officially recognized William Walker's regime as the legitimate government of Nicaragua.
We really need to let the weight of that sink in. The executive branch of the United States government looked at an American citizen who illegally raised a private mercenary army, blatantly violated U.S. neutrality laws, invaded a sovereign foreign nation, hijacked its internal politics, overthrew its leadership, and the U.S. government said, yes, this is legitimate. We recognize you as a pure head of state.
It is a stunning historical reality, and it speaks volumes about the volatile political climate of the United States in the 1850s. We have to view this through the lens of manifest destiny, this deeply entrenched cultural and political belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand its territorial reach across the North American continent and increasingly southward into Latin America and the Caribbean.
Right, for a significant portion of American politicians, particularly those sympathetic to the expansion of Southern slaveholding interests, Walker wasn't viewed as a rogue criminal. He was viewed as a vanguard. He was engaging in geopolitical outsourcing. He was doing the aggressive, imperial, dirty work of expansion that the U.S. federal government could not officially sanction without triggering a massive international war.
And by extending official diplomatic recognition, the Pierce administration lent incredible weight to Walker's illegal enterprise. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture. Recognition meant Walker had access to international credit markets. It meant he could openly purchase weapons and secure loans. It provided him with a veneer of international respectability that insulated him from immediate foreign intervention.
So Walker has secured the presidency. He has the guns, he has dropped the puppet government, and he has the diplomatic backing of the United States. He finally has the unchecked power to enact his true vision for Central America. And that vision was designed to violently reverse decades of established law.
We are moving into the ideological core of his rule now. The mercenary adventure formally morphs into a horrifying, systematic attempt to construct a literal slave empire from the ground up. On September 22, 1856, President William Walker issues a decree that fundamentally alters the nature of his presence in Latin America. He decrees the official reinstatement of slavery in Nicaragua.
To grasp the magnitude of that decree, we really have to look at the legal history of the region. This was not a case of Walker introducing slavery to a territory where its legal status was ambiguous. This was an aggressive, deliberate overturning of established abolition.
Exactly. The Central American Federation had enacted comprehensive anti-slavery legislation a full generation earlier, back in the 1820s. Following their independence from Spain, the eradication of human bondage was woven into the legal and moral fabric of the newly independent republics. While the specific constitutional dates vary slightly between the federal decrees and subsequent Nicaraguan state laws, the absolute reality on the ground was that Nicaragua had been free soil for over 30 years. Walker's decree was a violent rollback of that moral progress.
And the reinstatement of slavery was just the cornerstone of a much broader demographic overhaul. Walker was systematically attempting to erase the existing culture to support this new slave state. He decreed that English was now an official language of the Republic alongside Spanish. He began aggressively reorganizing land titles, which was just a mechanism to effectively confiscate massive, fertile estates from native Nicaraguans so they could be redistributed. He altered the currency system, and he completely revamped immigration policies.
And the explicit goal of every single one of those policy changes was to lure white settlers, specifically planters from the American South, to migrate to Nicaragua and form a new dominant ruling class over the native population and imported enslaved labor.
This forces us to ask a critical question about his underlying logic. Why take this specific route? I mean, if you were a dictator trying to solidify control over a volatile country, deliberately alienating the entire local population by overturning their abolition laws seems like political suicide. Was this purely ideological fanaticism?
Walker's own writings provide a chillingly clear answer. In 1860, he published a memoir titled The War in Nicaragua. Historians read this text critically, of course, recognizing it as a piece of self-serving propaganda written after his defeat, but he is unflinchingly explicit about his rationale regarding the slavery decree. It is the ideological engine of his entire project. He argued, bluntly and with intense racist conviction, that slavery was the only biological and economic mechanism that could permanently bind the white Anglo-Saxon settler to the tropical environment of Central America.
So his logic is that white American colonists will not remain in the tropics, and they will not successfully colonize the land unless they have a permanently subjugated enslaved labor force to perform the brutal agricultural work for them.
That is the terrifying thesis of the slave empire dream in its most literal form. For Walker, it was not merely about annexing land or extracting gold. It was about the deliberate, top-down sociological reconstruction of a Caribbean-facing slave society. He believed that without slavery, any white colonization effort would inevitably fail or just be absorbed by the local population.
But I want to challenge the practicality of this, though, because there is a vast gulf between writing a racist theory in a memoir and actually executing it on the ground while fighting a war. By late 1856, when this decree is issued, Walker's local support in Nicaragua is fracturing rapidly. The puppet government is gone. The neighboring Central American nations are mobilizing armies against him. He desperately needs reinforcements, weapons, and money.
Which brings us to the core of the historical debate surrounding the decree.
Right. Was this a genuine, deeply held attempt to begin importing enslaved people that very week? Or was this decree essentially cynical, desperate HR? Was it a giant, flashing recruiting signal aimed directly at the pre-Civil War American South, basically saying, listen, slaveholders, the political walls are closing in on you in the U.S.
Yeah.
Come bring your capital, your guns, and your young men down here, because I am building a paradise specifically for you.
And we have to frame this objectively based on the timeline and the texts. It is an undeniable historical fact that the decree was passed into law. It was not a rumor. It was official state policy on paper. However, Walker's regime began to face catastrophic military and logistical collapse so shortly after the decree was issued that historians fiercely debate its practical application on the ground.
Because building a plantation economy takes years. You can't just decree it and suddenly have massive slave markets and agricultural infrastructure functioning the next month while you were literally being shot at.
Precisely. How much slavery was actually practiced in Nicaragua during those chaotic final months is highly uncertain and heavily debated by scholars. There simply was no time to establish the physical infrastructure he envisioned. Because of this reality, many historians argue that while Walker's personal belief in white supremacy was undoubtedly genuine, the specific timing of the decree suggests it served primarily as a tool of political propaganda. It was a desperate plea for logistical and military salvation from the American South at the exact moment his local foundation in Nicaragua was crumbling.
He is trying to tap into the massive, boiling political tension over slavery happening back in the United States, hoping the southern states will view him as the champion of their economic system and flood his army with reinforcements.
He was recasting a mercenary adventure that had gone wrong into a holy war for pro-slavery expansionism. But here is the fatal flaw in his entire ideological dream. Whether the decree was a genuine blueprint for society or a cynical recruiting tool, it required one absolute necessity to function: a steady, uninterrupted flow of men, weapons, and money arriving on steamships from the U.S. coasts.
And to secure that maritime lifeline, Walker makes what has to be the most catastrophic financial miscalculation of his entire life. He decides to bite the hand that literally built the route he is sitting on.
This is where the story shifts drastically from ideological grandstanding to a masterclass in corporate vengeance. Because while Walker is dreaming of a vast empire, he fundamentally misunderstands where the true power of the 19th century actually resides. He thought he could outmaneuver the titans of American industry.
We have to follow the shipping routes to understand how this all falls apart. Let's look at Vanderbilt's war and the terrifying, unaccountable power of private capital. As we established, the primary economic driver of this entire conflict was the transit concession held by Cornelius Vanderbilt's Accessory Transit Company.
And Walker, feeling secure in his new presidency and desperate for more direct control over the revenues, enters into a secret collusion with two men, C.K. Garrison and Charles Morgan. Now, these men were technically Vanderbilt's own business associates.
Wait, so Garrison and Morgan were, they were his own guys?
Yes, they managed the complex operations for the transit company in San Francisco and New York. But they were also his bitter rivals, looking to seize control of the enterprise from within.
Oh, wow. So they scheme with Walker to orchestrate a massive corporate coup. Walker uses his executive power as the head of the Nicaraguan government to abruptly revoke the legitimate charter of Vanderbilt's Accessory Transit Company. He legally seizes all of Vanderbilt's physical assets in Nicaragua, the docks, the warehouses, the riverboats, and immediately hands the entire transit route over to a new company controlled by Garrison and Morgan.
In return for handing them a monopoly on global transit, Garrison and Morgan promised to provide Walker with highly favorable shipping rates, steady lines of credit, and most importantly, a continuous, guaranteed flow of fresh recruits from the United States to fight in his army.
It's like a tiny, aggressive startup CEO deciding to illegally seize the physical server farms of a trillion-dollar tech monopoly, assuming the monopoly will just roll over and accept the new management. I mean, it is incredibly arrogant, it is breathtakingly short-sighted, and it is absolutely guaranteed to invite total scorched earth destruction.
Walker essentially stole the most prized, lucrative possession of the richest, most ruthless businessman in America. When Vanderbilt, sitting in New York, discovered that his own lieutenants had betrayed him and a mercenary had stolen his transit route, his retaliation was not a diplomatic protest. It was methodical, comprehensive, and utterly devastating. Vanderbilt leveraged his immense private fortune to freeze the logistics of the entire operation.
How exactly does a civilian CEO destroy a foreign president, though? Like, what does that look like?
Well, first, Vanderbilt targeted the ocean routes. He immediately cut off the massive steamship connections that Garrison and Morgan were relying on to make the route profitable. Vanderbilt launched a massive aggressive price war. He deployed his own ships and undercut ticket prices so severely, offering to carry passengers to California for a fraction of the cost, sometimes practically at a loss, that Garrison and Morgan simply could not afford to run their ships.
So by disrupting the maritime transit on the oceans, Vanderbilt chokes off Walker's lifeline at the source. The steady flow of American reinforcements, the crates of modern rifles, the lines of credit that Walker desperately needed to sustain his army, they simply stopped arriving at the Nicaraguan ports.
But starving the supply lines from the outside was only half of Vanderbilt's strategy. He knew he needed Walker physically removed from the transit route entirely, so he threw his immense private fortune and his operational intelligence apparatus behind the Central American coalition that was actively forming to fight Walker.
Vanderbilt, a private citizen, starts financing and advising foreign governments to fight his corporate rival. That is wild.
The historical records strongly indicate Vanderbilt dispatched agents to Central America to advise the coalition governments. But his most consequential move was logistical. Vanderbilt's agents provided the crucial intelligence, the technical knowledge, and the tactical support needed for the coalition forces to launch a highly coordinated surprise attack to seize the transit routes, shallow draft river steamboats, and lake craft.
The exact same boats Walker relies on to move his troops across the country.
Precisely. In the 1850s, if you don't control the riverboats on the San Juan, you cannot move an army effectively through the dense Nicaraguan jungle. Vanderbilt engineered a scenario where the coalition forces captured those boats, leaving Walker's forces geographically stranded and completely immobilized internally. The very logistical network that Vanderbilt had built, which made Nicaragua so valuable, was deliberately and methodically turned into the weapon of Walker's destruction.
When we view this through the lens of our core thesis, the picture becomes incredibly stark. We spent a lot of time analyzing Walker's pro-slavery ideology and his grand dreams of colonization. But when you look at the mechanics of his defeat, it begs a massive question. Did Vanderbilt's corporate ledger matter more than Walker's ideological goals?
If you follow the money and the shipping routes, a very compelling argument emerges that Walker lived and died entirely by Vanderbilt's grace. Walker's initial military rise tracks perfectly with his unimpeded access to the transit route, bringing him men and guns. His rapid, catastrophic fall tracks exactly with Vanderbilt's corporate decision to shut that route down and fund his enemies. While Walker's ideological goals were broadcast loudly to the world, they were entirely, fatally dependent on a logistical supply chain he did not control. When private capital turned against him, the ideological empire collapsed in a matter of months.
It is a cold, sobering reminder that grand historical visions, no matter how terrifying, are often entirely at the mercy of who controls the boats. However, to reduce this entirely to a corporate turf war orchestrated from New York would be doing a massive disservice to the actual human cost on the ground. Because while Vanderbilt was dismantling Walker's supply lines from the outside, something profound and permanent was happening on the inside.
Yes, the people of Central America were rising up. They were facing a heavily armed, American-backed filibuster who had explicitly decreed his intention to subjugate them. And they realized that defeating him required a level of cooperation they had never truly achieved before. We have to look at how nations are forged in the fire of resistance.
Prior to Walker's arrival, the concept of a unified Central America was practically dead. Following their independence from Spain, the attempt at a unified federation had collapsed into bitter regionalism, border disputes, and the very civil wars that brought Walker to Nicaragua in the first place.
They were deeply fragmented states. But Walker's naked aggression, his usurpation of the presidency, and his terrifying decrees changed the political calculus for everyone in the region. He stopped being a participant in a local Nicaraguan squabble and became a regional monster. And the nation that recognized this existential threat first and articulated it most clearly was Costa Rica.
On February 27, 1856, the president of Costa Rica, Juan Rafael Mora, takes a decisive, historic step. He formally declares war on William Walker. And he doesn't just quietly mobilize a militia. He issues a massive public proclamation that shifts the entire framing of the conflict.
Historians view Mora Porras's proclamation as a foundational document of Costa Rican nationhood. When you read the text, he does not frame the impending conflict as a standard border dispute or a factional rivalry over trade routes. He frames Walker and his American filibusters as an existential threat to the independence, the sovereignty, and the very existence of all Central Americans.
He is reading between the lines of Walker's actions and telling his people this is not about the liberals in Leon versus the conservatives in Granada anymore. This is a foreign force coming to colonize our land and enslave us all.
Mora elevated the conflict from a political skirmish to a sacred defense of the homeland. And this powerful rhetoric was immediately backed by swift, decisive military action. Less than a month after the declaration, on March 20th, 1856, a column of Walker's filibusters crossed the border into Costa Rican territory. They were met by the newly mobilized Costa Rican militia at the Battle of Santa Rosa.
And the Costa Ricans completely rout them.
In a matter of minutes, the filibusters, who had cultivated this aura of invincibility with their modern rifles and aggressive tactics, were caught completely off guard and shattered by the organized, highly motivated local forces. The psychological impact of the Battle of Santa Rosa cannot be overstated. It broke the myth of American filibuster invulnerability.
The news of that victory ripples across the isthmus. It proves that Walker can bleed, and it galvanizes the rest of the region to act on Mora warning. The coalition rapidly widens. Recognizing the shared danger, the neighboring republics begin to mobilize their own armies. Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala all send thousands of troops southward to join the effort against Walker. It transforms from a Costa Rican defense into a true pan-Central American regional alliance.
And the legacy of this mobilization is permanently embedded in the culture of these nations today. A prime example is the Honduran and Salvadoran troops who marched into Nicaragua. They were led by a highly respected military figure named General Florencio Cetric.
This is one of those fascinating historical details where a military campaign literally gives birth to a modern national identity. The soldiers serving under General Zatruk were commonly referred to by the locals as Zatruches. It was just a shorthand to identify which column they belonged to.
But over time, through the natural phonetic evolution of language and pronunciation in the region, the word Zapruches slowly morphed into the word Catrachos.
And today, right now, Catracho is the colloquial, deeply affectionate nickname that Hondurans use to refer to themselves. It is a point of immense national pride. When a Honduran calls themselves a Catracho, they are carrying a linguistic legacy that stems directly from the soldiers who marched across borders to stop William Walker's slave empire.
It perfectly encapsulates the profound, unintended irony of Walker's expedition. Here's a man who set out to completely erase Central American sovereignty. He wanted to conquer these fragmented states and mash them into a single, subservient colonial holding for white planters. But by acting as a terrifying shared enemy who so violently denied their right to exist, he inadvertently forced these 5 fragmented republics to rehearse being unified nations.
By trying to destroy them, he gave them a profound reason to exist together. I mean, they had to share military intelligence, they had to coordinate massive troop movements across international borders, they had to draft joint political proclamations, and they had to bleed together on the same battlefields. The act of resisting the filibuster forged a modern Central American identity in a way that decades of peaceful politics never could.
But that resistance came at a catastrophic cost. As the coalition armies pushed deeper into Nicaragua, and as Vanderbilt squeezed the supply lines from the coast, Walker was pushed to the absolute brink. This desperation leads to the conflict's most brutal, destructive, and myth-making moments. We have to look at the realities on the ground as the noose tightened around the filibuster regime.
We're going to examine 2 incredibly contrasting symbols that emerge from this final phase of the war. On one hand, you have the ultimate symbol of constructive sacrifice, embodied by a young man named Juan Santamaría, and on the other, you have the ultimate symbol of nihilistic destruction, the ruin of the ancient city of Granada. Let's start with Santamaría, because his story is the beating heart of Costa Rican national memory.
Following their initial victory at Santa Rosa, the Costa Rican army pushes northward into Nicaragua and confronts Walker's main forces at the Second Battle of Livos on April 11, 1856. This is not a skirmish in a field. This is a brutal, grinding urban fight.
The Costa Rican assault stalls in the center of the town because a group of Walker's filibusters have heavily fortified a large building, a hostel known as the Maison de Guerra. From the vantage point of this stronghold, the Americans are pouring devastating concentrated rifle fire down into the streets, cutting the Costa Rican ranks to pieces. The military reality is simple. The advance cannot proceed, and the battle cannot be won unless that specific stronghold is neutralized.
According to the historical accounts that form the absolute core of Costa Rican national identity, a young, humble volunteer steps forward to solve the tactical problem. A drummer boy, or a laborer, named Juan Santamaría, volunteers for what is essentially a suicide mission. He takes a torch, runs through the gauntlet of concentrated enemy fire in the open street, and manages to set the thatched roof of the fortified hostel ablaze.
Knowing he almost certainly will not survive the run. And he doesn't. He succeeds in torching the building, which forces the filibusters to abandon their fortified position and breaks the stalemate of the battle. But Santamaría is mortally wounded in the process.
What is vital to understand here is the rapid transition from a localized act of combat to an eternal national myth. Juan Santamaría transforms from a foot soldier into Costa Rica's absolute preeminent national hero. He comes to represent the idealized vision of the Republic, the common, humble citizen willing to sacrifice everything to defend the homeland from foreign tyranny. To this day, April 11th, the date of the Second Battle of Rivas, remains a major national holiday in Costa Rica.
It is the ultimate symbol of dying to build something larger than yourself. Now we have to contrast that act of constructive sacrifice with the actions of William Walker as his grip on power entirely collapses. This brings us back to the city of Granada, the conservative capital that Walker had so shockingly captured back in 1855.
By late 1856, Walker's position is militarily untenable. He is being squeezed on all sides by the Central American coalition forces, and he has absolutely no fresh supplies or reinforcements coming in because Vanderbilt has sealed the ports. Walker realizes he simply lacks the manpower to hold the city of Granada against the advancing armies, so he makes the tactical decision to abandon it. But he refuses to simply retreat and leave the city intact for his enemies to reclaim.
He decides to erase it from the map.
In December 1856, Walker orders his most capable commander, a British-born mercenary general named Charles Frederick Henningsen, to destroy the city. And we must be incredibly clear about the scale of this atrocity. Granada was not merely a military outpost or a temporary camp. It was one of the oldest, most historic, and most architecturally significant colonial cities in the Americas. It was the cultural heart of the conservative faction.
Henningsen doesn't just set a few fires on his way out of town. He engages in a systematic, methodical razing of the city that lasts for roughly 3 weeks. While fighting off coalition skirmishers, Henningsen's men systematically used dynamite and fire to level ancient churches, grand colonial mansions, public squares, and thousands of civilian homes. They burned the city down to its very foundations, reducing centuries of history, art, and infrastructure to a massive field of ash and rubble.
It was an act of pure, spiteful nihilism. The logic was horrific. It was basically, if I cannot possess this country, I will ensure there is nothing left for anyone else to possess. And the most chilling detail of this entire campaign is the physical message they left behind in the ruins. As Henningsen and his remaining forces finally retreated from the smoldering wasteland they had created, they drove a lance into the ground amid the ashes of the central plaza. Attached to it was a piece of rawhide bearing a haunting 3-word epitaph written in Spanish.
Aquí fue Granada.
Exactly. Here was Granada.
It is a devastating image, and as you pointed out, the contrast is absolute. Santamaría sacrificed himself to ensure his nation would endure. Walker destroyed an entire ancient city simply because he realized he was too weak to keep it. But the physical destruction of the architecture was only part of the horror unfolding on the ground. We also have to address the biological nightmare that was gutting the region at the exact same time.
We do. And this requires a careful shift in our tone, as we must navigate a deeply complex and sensitive piece of historiography with absolute objectivity. Compounding the ruin of the war was disease. A catastrophic cholera epidemic swept through the entire theater of war in 1856.
Cholera in the 1850s, especially in the context of a military campaign, is practically a death sentence. It causes rapid, severe dehydration, and in an era before intravenous fluids and modern antibiotics, it can kill a healthy adult within hours of the first symptoms. This epidemic gutted the armies on all sides of the conflict. The Costa Rican military in particular was devastated by the outbreak, and as their sick and dying soldiers retreated southward back to their homeland, they unwittingly carried the pathogen back to the civilian population. The result was apocalyptic for Costa Rica. Roughly 10% of the entire country's population perished from the disease.
It was a national trauma layered on top of a brutal war of survival. But there is a very specific, deeply dark allegation associated with this outbreak in Nicaragua that we must address.
And we need to frame this carefully for you, the listener. What is the specific claim being made here?
The claim, which is deeply embedded in certain regional historical memories and accounts originating from Walker's Central American enemies, alleges that the spread of cholera was not merely a natural epidemiological tragedy, but a deliberate act of biological warfare orchestrated by the filibusters. Specifically, it is alleged that following the heavy casualties at the battles around Rivas, Walker's men deliberately took the corpses of cholera victims and threw them into the local wells, intentionally fouling the fresh water supply to spread the disease among the advancing coalition troops and the local civilian population.
Okay, we need to be incredibly clear and responsible here. We're looking at the sources. Is this deliberate well poisoning an established, verified historical fact? Or is it a contested rumor born out of wartime propaganda?
We must explicitly flag this as a contested allegation reported by Walker's enemies. It is not an established historical fact. While you will find this claim circulating widely in regional historical memory and occasionally stated flatly in less rigorous popular summaries, professional historians treat it with extreme caution and generally attribute it to the partisan history of the era.
Why does the historical consensus lean away from treating it as fact?
Well, for two main reasons. First, the documentary evidence relies almost entirely on partisan wartime accounts generated by forces actively trying to demonize a foreign invader, an invader who, let's remember, was already committing documented atrocities like the burning of Granada. Second, from an epidemiological standpoint, cholera moves swiftly and devastatingly through the unsanitary, crowded military encampments of the 19th century everywhere in the world. The bacteria, Vibrio cholerae, spreads incredibly easily through water runoff contaminated by human waste. In any military camp lacking modern sanitation, which describes every camp in this war, the environment itself is a powder keg for the disease.
Right. The natural realities of 19th century warfare meant that deliberate well poisoning wasn't even necessary to trigger a massive lethal outbreak. The horrific conditions of the camps did the work naturally. So, to separate fact from memory, we know for an absolute fact that Walker ordered the methodical, documented destruction of Granada. That is an undeniable, verified atrocity. But the allegation that he intentionally poisoned wells with corpses to spread cholera remains unverified. We have to attribute that claim strictly to the deeply traumatized partisan memory of the era, rather than stating it as a settled truth.
That is the only responsible historical approach. The tragedy of the cholera epidemic and the staggering loss of civilian life is profound enough without presenting contested wartime rumors as absolute fact.
Surrounded by a coalition of 5 nations, his supply lines severed by Vanderbilt's financial warfare, his army decimated by disease and desertion, and his grand capital reduced to ashes, the gray-eyed man of destiny essentially ran out of time.
His position was entirely hopeless. By the spring of 1857, Walker was besieged in the town of Rivas. His remaining men were starving, riddled with disease, and incapable of breaking the siege. He realized that if he surrendered to the Central American coalition forces that surrounded him, he would undoubtedly face an immediate firing squad for the destruction he had wrought.
So he looks for a third option, like an escape hatch.
Yes, he manages to negotiate his way out under the protection of the very government that had, just a year prior, recognized him as a legitimate head of state. On May 1st, 1857, William Walker formally surrenders to United States Navy Commander Charles Henry Davis, who had arrived on the coast. Under the protection of the U.S. military, Walker and his remaining men are evacuated from Nicaragua and repatriated back to the United States.
I mean, he destroys a city, attempts to build a slave empire, causes the deaths of thousands, and he just gets on a boat and goes home.
For a time, yes. And disturbingly, he actually received a hero's welcome in certain parts of the American South, where he was still viewed as a champion of their economic interests. But his obsession with Central America would not let him rest. He would spend the next 3 years writing his memoir and plotting to return, organizing new, smaller, increasingly desperate filibuster expeditions. But the geopolitical window had closed, and his luck finally ran out. In 1860, he landed in Honduras with a tiny force, was captured by the British Royal Navy, who handed him over to the Honduran authorities. The Hondurans did not offer him a naval evacuation. They placed him against a wall and executed him by firing squad.
A violent end to an incredibly violent career. So let's pull all of these massive historical threads together. We have covered shifting shipping routes, corporate warfare, the forging of national identity, and ideological fanaticism. Let's do a final synthesis of its incredibly complex deep dive.
When we look back at the brief, horrifying empire of William Walker, we see the absolute embodiment of the central tension we established at the beginning of this exploration. Walker's regime was initially built upon the fragile foundation of Nicaragua's own internal political division. He ruthlessly exploited a local civil war to gain a foothold. Once in power, that regime was ideologically sustained by a terrifying, explicitly pro-slavery vision that sought to permanently alter the demography and morality of Central America. But ultimately, that massive ideological project was utterly destroyed by two very different, incredibly powerful forces acting in tandem.
The power of the corporate ledger and the power of national survival.
Precisely. He was crushed on one side by the cold, hard logistical realities of Cornelius Vanderbilt's global shipping empire, which methodically severed his lifeline to survival from abroad. And on the other side, he was ground down by the unyielding, unified resistance of the Central American people, a resistance that, ironically, forced them to forge the very national identities and unity that Walker had sought to erase.
It tells us that history isn't just shaped by grand, terrifying ideas or political decrees. Sometimes, the fate of nations is decided by who holds the paperwork for the transit concession and who controls the boats on the river. I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to ponder on your own. We've seen how Vanderbilt's corporate retaliation doomed Walker, starving his army of the men and guns he needed to survive. But what if the corporate betrayal had never happened? If William Walker had suppressed his arrogance and simply left Cornelius Vanderbilt's lucrative transit charter alone, could Vanderbilt's massive fleet of steamships have kept Walker's regime supplied with enough men and weapons to survive the coalition siege? Could private capital have kept him afloat long enough to establish a permanent, internationally recognized American slave state in the heart of Central America? And if that had happened, if a fully operational, expansionist slave empire had solidified just south of the border, how would that have altered the impending catastrophic explosion of the American Civil War just a few years later?
Imagine, you are the richest man in the world, and a mercenary steals the most valuable shipping lane on Earth from you. What do? You buy a war, and in doing so, you might just accidentally forge 5 nations and change the map of the world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.